I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
And so we evolved in our discussion toward the idea that something like the integrated course that Ryan referred to that said influenced him so much is in short supply. Jerry helped explain why that's so. Let me ask a kind of a naive question here. Why would it be important to have an integrated, interdisciplinary course to help students appreciate the nature and foundations of the economic system? Why should we care particularly about, just by example, in USA Today the other day, a gentleman named Stephen Prothero, who is a prominent religion professor at Boston University, he's waging a campaign, religion is not being taught at the university level. Should we privilege economics over religion? Is there something particular about it? Do we want to weigh in on the maybe we don't have to choose on those two, but why is economic, why do we want to weigh in on this, Jerry?
Well, I'm not sure economics is more important than religion. But the larger point is it's actually hard to get a handle on campuses on any of these big issues. And if you do teach the history of capitalism, or you teach courses on capitalism, it's important, I think, because it is so multifaceted, to teach it from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. And because there are a lot of legitimate controversies, it's important not to teach it from a political, ideological perspective. That's why, for example, if you're going to teach a course on religion, I don't think you could teach a respectable survey course on religion without dealing with either the parts of Hobbes' Leviathan or Spinoza's Tractatus that deal with biblical criticism and the implausibility of miracles, and David Hume's essay on miracles. Those should all be in a course on religion. In other words, it shouldn't be a course about orthodoxy. It should be a course about perspectives on religion. So too in teaching about capitalism. You should have multidisciplinary perspectives. You should have multiple ideological perspectives. I think the notion of a libertarian teaching a course on capitalism presents a lot of obstacles to fair and balanced treatment. You know, if you have a Leninist teach a course on socialism, kids are going to learn something, but there's probably a lot that they're not going to learn by virtue of bias. And because there is a lot more to capitalism than libertarian perspectives would lead you to believe, because it has many more problems, because it's much more multifaceted, I think courses that are oriented towards presenting an ideological line on capitalism are not what we need. We need courses that are, as I say, multifaceted ideologically, multifaceted from a disciplinary point of view. That may mean that you don't want one course that does this, but you want multiple courses offered by faculty from a variety of disciplines that present various elements of it, but which make an attempt to go beyond their own disciplinary boundaries and go beyond their own ideological propensities.
But at the same time, we heard earlier how difficult that might be to achieve. And might we risk letting the best be the enemy of the better here? And might it be important? Jeff, you teach a course on libertarianism at Harvard. I assume you think that's a valuable course.
So let me disagree with what Jerry just said. One, I think that the push for multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary courses has been a Trojan horse for mushy-minded liberalism, okay? Modern liberalism, not classical liberalism, leftism across campuses. So the multidisciplinary push has done great disservice to lots of students because it's like stew. It's not one any discipline. It's a little mush of all these different things. Now, I'm not saying we should ban them, but neither should, I think, a good university be promoting them, okay, excessively, in the way that we're doing, because they frequently are really quite bad and are not bringing a clear perspective. Second, I think that the nature of a professor in a course, not a statistics course, not maybe introductory or intermediate microeconomics, but in a course that's an elective, is to present that professor's perspective. It's not exactly to be fair and balanced. It's to be a little bit like a prosecutor or a defense attorney, make the best case for the perspective that you're pushing. Knowing that students have a choice to take other courses which take the opposite view, knowing that students have the opportunity to read lots of other things, to disagree with you. And so I think you can have an excellent course which has a very particular point of view. So my course at Harvard is an economics course. It's not a philosophy course. It reads economics papers. It discusses things in economics terms. It's called A Libertarian Perspective on Economic Social Policy. The students have zero confusion about what my position is. Okay, but I get students from all across the political spectrum who argue with me right, left, and center. Mm-hmm. And I think if I tried to make the critical case, the case against what I believe, that would be a disservice. I would never make that case very well because I don't really believe it. And I think a lot of the pieces of it are sort of false, so I would never do them justice. I think it's for someone else who has a different view to attack me and criticize me. Well, for example, Michael Sandel teaches a political science course, Harvard calls it a government course, called Justice, and he includes a week on libertarianism. And the representation of libertarianism that the students get from Michael Sandel is the most overly simplified, ridiculous, unfair, biased perspective of libertarianism. So I wish he just wouldn't do it at all. Okay? Okay? Now, he does invite me as a guest lecturer.
Out where you think the bias is at Harvard. Okay.
So I think having a discipline, not multidiscipline, is totally fine. And I think professors who present their point of view, whether it's about Milton, whether it's about politics, whether it's about a particular century of history, that's fine. Students will understand that.
And we have emerging here a really interesting division about what people call the theory of change, I suppose, right? And just to press you, Jeff, you're okay. Dan is telling us that it's 8-1, right, left to right.
So I'm not disagreeing with that at all.
Right, and so it's okay if everybody does his own thing from his own perspective, as opposed to pushing them in the framework that Jerry said everybody should buy into this idea that they should empathize, present empathetically critiques to their own point of view. You say, no, let's have a kind of a prosecutorial model, but you're outgunned. But you're okay with that.
I'm perfectly okay with that. And I also think we have to ask, is there a problem or where is the problem? We have millions of high school-age students, not just in the United States, all over the world, who kill themselves for 3, 4, 5 years. Hardly ever sleeping at night, doing 8 zillion extracurriculars, being on athletic teams, trying to get 2400s on their SATs. Okay. We have parents of all these kids who are killing themselves, driving the kids to soccer practice and SAT prep and all that, sacrificing financially by not going on vacation, doing this to get themselves into the schools that have exactly the curricula that we're sort of critiquing, that we're not entirely comfortable with.
Right.
All those students and parents think that this, elitist, fairly left-leaning, sort of liberal artsy model is what's good for them.
Wait.
How do we know that they're wrong?
Do they know that's what they're getting?
Most of them do. Many of them went to such institutions. Many of them can look at the curricula. They can read articles in papers. They can see all sorts of critiques out there. They can read Dan's perspective in the Wall Street Journal. So many of them have a perfectly good sense of what they're doing. Some of them send their kids off saying, I'm paying for this for 4 years, but you can't major in English. You have to major in economics.
So consumer protection.
And most of these kids end up getting good jobs and having good careers. So what's the market failure?
Okay, so consumer protection is a bit another issue here. But the market failure, I guess Jerry was saying, was that they might not understand, come out any different than they came in with their parental biases, right? They might not actually learn anything, and that's the goal, I guess, if I might say. But let's keep mining this question of whether we want to promote the idea of a grand integrated course, interdisciplinary, that is going to harken back to the Yale Directed Studies program, Chicago Great Books, Columbia, or whether specialization in what Jeff has called the prosecutorial model is the way to maintain an oasis of free market thinking in a leftist jungle. Ryan?
Yeah, I don't think we have to go as far back even to Yale or to Columbia or to the Great Books programs. I think we could start with the very helpful model set by two authors that I think would be on any decent philosophy of capitalism class, and those would be Adam Smith and F.A. Hayek. Smith is hired at the University of Glasgow as a professor of moral philosophy. What does he end up doing? He ends up teaching courses on rhetoric, on natural jurisprudence, on natural theology, on economics as we would define it today, on moral philosophy. F.A. Hayek at the University of Chicago teaches not in the economics department at the end of his career, but when he writes his big book, Constitution of Liberty, is teaching in the wonderful Committee on Social Thought, which is dedicated towards presenting a unified model of human knowledge. What's remarkable about both of these figures and the places in which they taught is that, again, what we're calling capitalism is not an isolated phenomenon to be labeled and to be put to the side and studied next to these other things. For both Smith and Hayek, the key thing to teach was the nature of the free society. And a capitalist economy was one part within a much broader vision. And I think that I can't speak for strategic purposes as how best to advance a certain mission on campus, but it does seem to me, and the thing that I truly care about, the intellectual honesty with which we present these ideas, that beginning with the concept of the free society and seeing a capitalist economy as part of that larger vision was not just important for Smith and Hayek, but also still a very worthy model for how we approach things practically today.
I think you and Jerry are co-teaching this same course. Bill, in the packet of readings that was distributed, you discuss a seminar you've been teaching, which sounds a little bit like it's not explicitly libertarian, but it's natural liberty, classical liberalism, and so it feels to me like you're planting your flag and having a beachhead, which is a little bit more like what Jeff is doing.
Absolutely. For me, classical liberalism is not an ideology as much as it is a field of inquiry with lots of very interesting questions, with a marvelous tradition. Great, if you want to look at the great books, as Ryan has suggested, a lot of those people you're going to be reading are classical liberals. The claim that there is a bias here, I think, is misplaced, because what matters is the critical acumen that one brings to a field of study. I think most classical liberals that I know do not consider classical liberalism a set of definitive conclusions, but rather a set of questions that are ultimately interesting, that provide one with good tools that can be investigated and open up new vistas. It's not the last chapter, it's the opening chapter in a student's education from my point of view. And when I offer my seminar, it's a first-year seminar, and my job is to expose the students to this wonderful tradition of ideas. It's not a platform for my particular personal views necessarily. Rather, it's an opportunity for students to think seriously about some very important questions, to interact with one another, and to debate these things in class in a civil, intelligent way.
But it's a self-selected group, right, because it's a seminar. Whereas I sense that what Jerry and Ryan are talking about is, can we assemble a sort of, a grand survey course that is going to be a requirement? It's going to verge back toward a core. I'm not saying you would be against that, but you're getting by with what you can achieve for now. But Jerry, you're
Yeah. By the way, just so I'm not misunderstood, I'm not against the existence of disciplines, and I think most education, a good deal of education in a college ought to be within disciplines. I think there's room, though, for courses that are transdisciplinary, and it's a challenge to get professors to stretch beyond their beyond their disciplinary boundaries. However, for any of the kinds of courses that I'm talking about, one course having to do with thinking about capitalism or multiple courses, I don't think they should be requirements. And this gets back to Jim Pearson's argument, and I want to take the opposite side. Courses that work well, great books courses that work well, are courses that students choose to take and that professors choose to teach. The directed studies program that Ryan was talking about and that he taught in, that one of my children took, is a great program because it's different from the Columbia program. Not that the content is so different, but the students who take it choose to take it. And that creates a much different atmosphere in the classroom. Also, the professors choose to teach it. So you have to understand, there are millions of people in millions of students in universities with a wide variety of backgrounds, a wide variety of interests. They're not, we're not talking about a Victorian elite here. I mean, there are new kinds of elites being created, but they have a diversity of interests. And you're not, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink unless he's thirsty. Unless you're thirsty and have some propensity for being interested in broad ideas. Mm-hmm. The fact that you're required to be exposed to those ideas is not going to create a situation where those ideas are going to have any influence upon you.
Right,
so I think courses that we're talking, insofar as we're talking about courses on capitalism, they should be voluntary.
Right, so you're disentangling two threads, right? One was the thread of, could these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary courses be created? Should they be offered? And you and Jeff had a difference of view on that. And then you were ultimately seconding Bill's view, which is, no, let's make it an offering. The struggle is to have the offering, not necessarily, it's a separable issue whether they should be required. Now, Sandra, you have an alternative take on this, which is reform of the economics profession, right? So your vessel, if you will, would be, I believe it's the most popular major on campus, economics.
I think so, that's right.
Right. Why is that, by the way? I guess people think it's an economical decision.
Self-interest would drive that result, I think.
But, right, rather than going the transdisciplinary route that Jerry, Ryan, and Bill all have alluded to, you're saying, no, let's work with what we've actually got here, which is there are a heck of a lot of students taking economics. It's a logical extension of the economics discussion to bring in the sorts of things that Smith and Hayek.
And let me just say, I don't want to argue that the course that's part of the gen ed requirements or courses that a student might take, the interdisciplinary course, I'm not trying to suggest that's not useful. I have 8 disciplines in one building in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, represented in that school, 13 faculty from a lot of different areas then. So, and my course is one that's cross-listed, as I said earlier, in economics and leadership studies. But I do think that within the economics major and even within the minor, there might be some room now, especially given what happened in the last couple of years, as faculty are reflecting on the curriculum and the revealed costs and benefits associated with the courses that are now required by an economics degree. There may be some space for opening up to have more courses on financial history, on regulation, on the history of banking, on the history of ideas, which would be the one that I would pick, because that's the place where you can really ask students to engage with the text, and whether you want to bring a perspective to it, as Jeff might, or whether you want to try to be open to different perspectives and let them read them. You can do that course either way in a history of economic thought course. As I was thinking about this conference, what I think that perhaps the problem, I've for many years argued the problem with the major is we don't have a history of thought, because I'm a history of thought person, and I think that was a self-serving argument. But what I came to realize in the last couple of weeks as I thought about this is we have, in the latter half of the 20th century, but even starting earlier, economists largely pulled away from all questions of morality, so that we no longer discuss prudence. We don't discuss the moral implication of saving. We don't talk about one's obligation to look after oneself and one's family. And so all of those questions are just, and again, I'm somewhat exaggerating, I'm generalizing here and speaking strongly, but to a large extent, those are off the table within the economics major. We've also pulled very much away from the history, from our past, and it seems to me that that a liberal society needs to know and understand its past, and we don't within the economics community, professoriate. In fact, we've, again, as a group, largely said that the past is simply not, is where old and bad ideas thrive, and we're new and scientific. You mentioned market failure. I would say that the past is a public good, as economists think about public goods. So what's that mean? It means that it's a good that anyone can consume free of charge. And if it's that sort of good, then it might be undersupplied. Certainly the returns to supplying the past of the ideas within economics are not, the private returns are not particularly high. This is why I'm a dean of a leadership studies school. And so consequently, it might be undersupplied and missupplied, that is misconstrued, so that I've done work on the phrase, the dismal science. It's a phrase that has been misused to suggest that economics is a very harsh science, which, as I said earlier, talking about Malthus, sort of happily looks at society and competition in a social Darwinian kind of way, and that's not at all how the dismal science was first used as a phrase. Thomas Carlyle used it in order to describe the science of economics, but what he was putting up as an alternative to markets was in fact re-enslavement. And so it's a very interesting sort of story about how we got associated with
that
with
really
this.
interesting paper is in your packet also, I should point out. So let's think about this. Is that, we heard from Bill that a lot of students they're only going to have one economics course. And so you're imagining changing the profession to allow for a stream of courses within the major, right? History of banking, history of finance, history of prudence and frugality, and the Protestant ethic.
And
right.
courses that look at institutions as opposed to simply abstracting from all of those.
Right, but
Sorry,
I wanted to get to Dan and say, the economic profession. Is it practical, in your view, to go in the direction? Are any of these approaches practical? The seminar, the interdisciplinary course, and then the economics reform approach. From what you know of the profession, is that plausible?
I think there's a question here of who is the agent you have in mind here. What's that person's context that they're making decisions? Is it someone who's just a member of the profession? Is it a department chair? Is it a university administrator? And I think the answers depend a lot on that kind of perspective, even if it's the same person in those different wearing those different hats.
Right. How would we actually get there from here is what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's hard to formulate even an answer to the question, I think, if you don't nail it down. But as far as people teaching courses that have these nice characteristics, I do think that you can do in economics, and probably it goes for the others as well, something quite interdisciplinary under the banner of any one of them. there's not that much policing of what you really put in your course, and there's not strong objections about whether you wander into ethics and politics and sociology.
I guess that's both good news and bad news, right?
Well, I appreciated what Jeff said about the Trojan horse of interdisciplinary and the actual reality of what that is. But broadly, I'm with everyone else. I think that the disciplinary boundaries are quite artificial. I see, and I'm sure folks here would agree, that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was, as it were, an extension of the broader umbrella of the theory of moral sentiments. So the idea of ripping economics out of a broader ethical program or question, I do think is very destructive. So I'm not sure where that leaves us about whether it's practical or what we can do. I do think for an individual, an energetic individual who wants to do these things, there is usually quite a bit of leeway.
Well, let's play. You gave us a brief lecture on principal-agent theory, which I appreciated. And how would we get there from here if we wanted to move? That sounds to me like you want to wage a battle within the American Economics Association, and Jerry, you want to wage a battle within the Catholic University. Where's the front here? And if we were to try to reinstitute a history of ideas that gives us the grounding to appreciate our situation in a fuller way, where's the front and how does one proceed? And that'll get us to our luncheon speaker too, but thoughts on that, Jerry?
Yeah, I don't think that there's one answer, and there's certainly not one size fits all. I think what you can try to do, I think Jeff's right, that people, and others have said this too, Dan said too, you can, within particular disciplines, people actually do have a good deal of leeway. The question is getting them to stretch their minds to make use of that leeway, even if the course is taught under a disciplinary umbrella. So what I would be inclined to do is offer some money, say $10,000, not to bribe people, but to give them, say, course release time to prepare a course that was beyond their normal boundaries.
You're a historian, not an economist, right?
Right. But I don't think it should come with ideological strings attached, that you're not going to teach the virtues of the free market. It does have some virtues, but if you're only teaching the virtues of the free market, then I think you're giving a kind of ideological course that shouldn't be offered actually in a university. So first of all, I think I think that there has to be a set of guidelines, but they have to be loose. So it has to involve various ideological perspectives. It has to involve some elements of history, philosophy, economics, say, and then let people from a variety of disciplines, including English literature and so on, teach a course that brings to bear some of their interests and expertise, and that allows them to do something that actually some of them would like to do, namely stretch themselves to think and teach about these kinds of broader perspectives. So I would say have a loose framework that many people can apply to and that fits in with, that makes some use of their own interests and propensities rather than trying to have some standard course that everybody is expected to teach.
Quick answers here. Jeff, would that work at Harvard? Somebody would get release time to develop a new syllabus. Is it easy to get a new course approved? And Ryan, as a junior faculty member, would that be attractive to you? Say, whoa, $10,000 for course release time, I'm there. But let me start with Jeff and go to Ryan.
That happens all the time. It's a standard part of the setup. It's trivial to get a new course approved. If you're a faculty member, you just say, I'm teaching a course on the religious foundations of capitalism. Boom, it's done. You don't have to get approval from anybody except your department chair, and the department chair's got better things to do than worry about that stuff. So, but of course, it's used to create all sorts of courses that are anti-capitalism, though that sort of flexibility. So, it's a two-edged sword.
Ryan?
I'm tenured now, but I'll still consider myself junior. That's fine.
Now, I've just committed the most grievous faux pas.
That's right. I want to be known as junior as long as I can milk that one.
I looked at the webpage and it said associate. I apologize.
That's right. More seriously, prior to receiving tenure, I would not have accepted a grant from an external agency to prepare a course, nor would I recommend to my current junior colleagues that are coming up for tenure to do such a thing.
Right, and so if there's a target of opportunity, it would have to be somebody like Jerry, for instance.
I think it would be money well spent to give Jerry money to develop such courses.
Well, in other words, this is a complicated business. One last thing before we go to Q&A. Jeff, you referred a while ago to universities are not just what happens in the classroom. They're atmospheres, they're environments, right? I think, for instance, of the Gotkin lectures at Harvard. More than 100 years old, named for the editor of the then New York Evening Post. An unbelievable series of lectures historically. Daniel Moynihan on the family, Clark Kerr on the future of the university, right? Are there non-course related ways that we should be thinking about here to influence? Sandra, you're nodding kind of strongly.
Yes, absolutely. Short answer. But we have some things at the University of Richmond that we do, the Marshall Center and the Summer Institute that you mentioned earlier. And for graduate students who are looking for colleagues that are scattered across the world, Europe, Japan, Canada, and the United States, to be able to come together to listen to each other's research projects for a couple of days in the summer. It's wonderful for them. They find that they're no longer, they realize they're not alone in the world, that people have research interests that are similar to theirs, and it's exhausting, but 4 days of papers all in plenary, and I find it's about half junior faculty or graduate students and half senior faculty, and to put them together in the same room with very eminent scholars and so on, they love it. Absolutely love it. We've done it 11 years in a row, and it's always a tremendous success.
All right, so I asked and answered my own question, and you said, well, no, let's look at faculty, and we can influence faculty in ways other than paying individual faculty members. Jeff, any quick thoughts about that larger environment since you brought it up?
I just think on most college campuses, all these things already exist. There's Republican clubs, Democratic clubs, conservative clubs, I mean, there are lots of speakers from all across the spectrum on all sorts of issues, and so that's one major way that students get exposed to a lot of things other than what they get in the classroom. And it's interesting, it's important, it's very useful. So that's one reason I'm less concerned about the fact that the faculty is predominantly left-leaning, because it's not the only source.
Right, right. Well, let's go to our question and answer period, and we've got a number of scholars from across the country here, and I would offer a special invitation for them to participate should they choose to. And the gentleman right there, yes. And if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone, and yes, next to Jacqueline. Yeah. If you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone. Hello. And identifying yourself for the record.
Hello, I'm Jason Palmer. I work for Kaplan Ventures, so I invest in education and startup companies.
Is this microphone working?
No. Hello. Hi, Jason Palmer, Kaplan Ventures. I invest in startup companies. It's still not
working.
One thing that I was wondering if the panel could comment on is a lot of the conversation has been about a free society and economic theory in elite institutions. However, more and more students are going to community colleges, for-profit universities. I work for a company that has a for-profit university. We're very economic-oriented. And I wonder if we're not missing out on a larger population of people who do need to understand economic theory much more, who do not attend the elite institutions. Companies that I invest in often want to sell to the biggest companies on the planet or to ivory tower institutions. That is the toughest market to change, and that's what you guys are trying to do. Why not go after kind of the edges of the market where millions and millions of students are being educated and try to make this impact there, where you can have much more impact much more rapidly, I think.
Does anybody want to speak to that? Does have a sense of what sort of exposure might go on at the I mean, at different levels. Yes, Sandra.
Say that's a really important point, partly because that's the only institution that those students are going to, but then secondly because students are increasingly going to community colleges and then transferring into, to finish up their degree into a liberal arts college. So all of the gen ed requirements that we've been talking about here would be, or most of them, would be things that they fulfill somewhere else. So we can create all the courses we want at the University of Richmond, but they're not taking them because they transfer in with those credits already in place. I have one idea for those sorts of students, and also for students who are at liberal arts colleges, but I've thought that it might be good to put together a reader, and we're not going to change the curriculum of an Econ 101 or an Econ 102 class very much, because they need to be taught from the textbooks that are used and so on at community colleges. But one could have a reader that shows students that all of the ideas that they're learning about, or many of them, were or are contested. That Homo economicus, for instance, is not something that just got made up 10 years ago, but which in the 19th century was really the subject of a serious debate. And often the economists come out on the good side, that is the side that we'd like them to come out on, so that though we may have disdain, as Marilyn said, society might speak disdainfully about economics or economists today. In fact, if you show students that when it came to women earning the right to own property, John Stuart Mill actually paid dearly for making that case in the middle of the 19th century. That's something that you could put into a reader fairly easily, and it could accompany a course that a student takes at a community college.
So if I could paraphrase what you're saying, I think you're saying that elite institutions, if you will, can produce materials that can filter out to the field and influence the field, just as in an earlier era, the great books idea was not confined in its influence on the culture to those institutions that offered it. Right. Other questions? Yes, ma'am, right there.
I'm Michelle Vacris from Christopher Newport University in Virginia. We're a small public liberal arts university. And I'd like to get the panel's initial reaction to a plan of attack that we've taken at CNU. We've taken the interdisciplinary side of things, and we have a whole program in American Studies that is somewhat unique among American Studies programs because it's based on an appreciation of the foundations of a free society, and it has a strong focus on capitalism. And we are able to look at capitalism and culture and politics all together through this interdisciplinary major. So that's something a little different from the interdisciplinary course or the revision of the economics curriculum itself. And I'm wondering, I've taken some very good ideas away from your discussions, but I'm wondering if you think that might be a fruitful endeavor.
Right, so it's a variation on the course into a new context, right, of the interdisciplinary major. Ryan?
But it sounds like a wonderful project, exactly the thing when I was an undergraduate I wish I had at my undergraduate university, and I'm sure you get very good students. The first question I guess I would have would be, it must be challenging to recruit faculty to some degree to teach in such a program because disciplinary training and everything that we do in PhD programs is dedicated towards generating highly specialized research. Then to ask somebody to make that turn once they're in the classroom to be able to speak to broader themes and to interact with colleagues and do something collective from other themes, I can imagine it's a challenge. I'd be very curious to hear more from you about how one manages that particular challenge. But it seems to me as a program, wonderful and should be welcomed, and I'd like to hear more about the model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Remind people again of the name of the university because you said it quickly, and I want everybody to be able to hear it.
It's Christopher Newport University in Virginia.
Great, thank you so much. Right. Yes, gentleman, way in the back.
Hi, my name is Peter Anderson, and I'm a member of the Manhattan Institute. And there's an opinion that surfaced from the panel about professors not exercising as much influence as we might think. on the attitudes and beliefs of their students, that they can think for themselves. There are multiple sources of opinion that they're exposed to. Maybe you can help me out with a survey that I understand was recently conducted about college students' attitudes about the free enterprise system and whether they thought it was good or preferred over other economic models. And this was a follow-up to a prior survey, and I don't know how long the prior survey had been conducted. But what I understand is there's definite shift in student attitudes towards believing that more collectivist economic models were a better way to organize economies. That roughly now it's about a third of students thought free enterprise was the best system, about a third felt a more collectivist model was, about another third they weren't sure. So could you comment on that survey if you're familiar with what I'm describing, and to explain what you believe are the factors behind that shift in student attitudes?
Right, good. Well, Jerry and then Sandra.
It sounds like a worthless survey to me. First of all, because the term free enterprise system is a loaded one. It means different things to different people. I don't know how many of the people that were asked that survey would ask that question would have any notion of what kind of collectivist system they're talking about. There are people, perhaps some people in the room, who think we live in a collectivist system. That's not a very useful descriptor. So I think that sounds like a lot of ideological eyewash one way and a lot of vague terms. Also, if students are more skeptical of free market systems today than they were 10 years ago, that's a good thing. You have to be sleepwalking through the world to have the same faith in markets today that you did 10 years ago.
Right, but you know, the gentleman is making tell us what you really think, Jerry. But the gentleman's making an interesting point, it seems to me, and that is, are we as a group here, as a panel, have we been too Pollyanna-ish about the whole thing, right? Dan's telling us the deck is stacked, the left runs the show, and then we're saying, well, we can construct these constructive solutions and really everything is okay, right? Is everything okay, or are students coming in, tilting even farther left towards social justice, whatever, and we just have rose-colored glasses on here today? If I might take what you've done and take it a step further, okay, with your permission. Jeff, you've been defending the status quo here, I got to say.
I'm not defending the status quo. My position is that the fact that capitalism is not taught as much on campus as I might like to see is a small part of a much, much bigger problem, which is that the way higher education is designed, okay, is not serving the needs of a large fraction of the students. And the specific thing I focus on is that there's a huge amount of government subsidy and a huge amount of restrictions on what students can choose to do when they seek higher education. In the ideal world that I would design, if there is subsidy for people to get higher education at all, it comes in the form of vouchers, so that students who want to choose to go for 2 or 3 or 4 years to get a medical degree starting at age 18, or a law degree, or an engineering degree, or a culinary arts degree, or any of zillions of things, have the ability to do so if we think that needs to be subsidized. It's not so clear it does need to be subsidized, rather than only providing the subsidy in the form of a University of Michigan, a University of California, Berkeley, and so on, where a student is pretty much forced to take liberal arts and is required to take a lot of courses which are incredibly antithetical to capitalism. And its requirements, okay, and subsidy for some things relative to others, that I think is a problem, but it's way, way, way bigger, okay, than the capitalism issue. It's the fact that there's way too much government involved.
Right, so Jeff has gone way non-incremental and said, let's charterize the university. It's the overall structure of the system that we need to rethink in lines that I think this gentleman here would be quite pleased about. But Sandra?
If I could just add one point. I think students aren't encouraged enough to think about trade-offs and to think about different institutional frameworks. And I'm going to go back to the point about the survey. And I have no idea what the survey, whether it's good or bad, its results. But 20 years of textbooks in economics by some of the best known economists in the country, including Paul Samuelson. From 1960 to 1980, I've studied them in great detail, and they present the Soviet Union and the United States using the same institutional framework, a production possibility curve, and then making the case that because the Soviet Union has more higher levels of capital investment, it must be growing faster. And then for 20 years, looking at the data and rewriting the past, because in fact, it wasn't the case that these predictions were coming true. Now, so economists were in economic textbooks that were used by millions of American students, were saying that we were on a production possibility curve here and in the Soviet Union. It takes incentives to get people to be on a production possibility curve, and that simply was not discussed in these books. So how did they get there? Were they on there? Were they below it? How did they move up to it? And so on. Those kinds of questions about the very different institutional frameworks that existed in these two kinds of economies were abstracted from in economic textbooks for several decades.
Right, so to take Jerry's skepticism, you wish Paul Samuelson would have been more skeptical toward the Soviet Union when that was on the table. Right. We have time for, yes, Ira Stoll from the Future of Capitalism project.
Thanks. It's been 20 years since I was a college student, but one of the things we had at Harvard then was something called the Dunster House Grill, where it was a student-run business in one of the dormitories where a different group of students took it over every year, and they could decide to buy a milkshake machine and sell milkshakes, and they could change the prices on the food, and they got to keep the money at the end. And I wonder if you guys have, first of all, if it's still there, and second of all, if you have any other thoughts on not lectures as outside of course activities, but as student-run businesses that maybe could provide useful services to other students and be useful as education for students who may learn more by changing the price on the milkshake than by going to a lecture about it.
There are a lot of student-run enterprises that get some sort of umbrella from Harvard. A lot of them do have a sort of flavor of public service, public good, or something like that. One that was started and developed well by one of my former students, first year I taught the Libertarian course, basically was, they tried to shut it down because he was being too successful and too capitalistic. It was known as Dorm Aid, and he basically was offering a service to come to people's dorms, get their laundry, take the laundry out, clean it, bring it back, come in, do maid service in the dorms and so on. And he's now got it operating at a bunch of universities all over the country. It was very successful. So the unions basically get in the way.
And then there's Facebook.
And then there's Facebook. So.
Right. Thoughts about other ways the spirit of capitalism, in keeping with the name of Ira's project, could be nurtured? Junior achievement? No?
I don't know.
At any rate. Well, I think on that note, we're going to thank our panel.
I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking at the Manhattan Institute.